Oh man, how do I even begin to describe the sheer emotional experience that this movie brought along? Start from the beginning. And when you get to the end, well, gotta start somewhere. Can I just say that there's a reason why a lot of people have been getting into anime in the first place. The East has been appealing to older audiences with mature themes and philosophical ideas with their anime presentations. Of course, many in the anime community will have their different tastes in anime. Some will prefer the more over-the-top types like Dragon Ball Z, or perhaps the more girly types like Sailor Moon. Then you have people like me, who are in it for mature stories with deep thematic storytelling. This is why I latch on to anime presentations like many of the Studio Ghibli movies, Cowboy Bebop, and of course, Violet Evergarden. This series is only 14 or so episodes long, and there doesn't seem to be any promise of a second season as of making this video. But this franchise is almost perfect. I had some somewhat higher expectations for their first movie, and I wouldn't say this is terrible by any means. Some might even argue this might be a nice little introduction to Violet Evergarden for younger people. But for a movie based on a story like this, I was really expecting stakes to be raised personally, and that's exactly what the second movie did. This movie was an explosive box office success in Japan, but I'm going to tell you now, this movie made in 2020 and released on Netflix in 2021, a few days ago, this movie will not have nearly as much impact on you, the viewer, if you haven't watched this series and been properly invested in it. Because there are people out there who don't really like this series as much as many other people due to its melodrama and some strange elements, which I can understand. I mean, not every story is going to appeal to everybody. But this movie ties into the events of this story here. So every scene, every character development, every revelation in this movie will only move you if you understand the full context of what's going on and the sheer thematic weight of the emotions that go along with it. So, needless to say, spoilers are abound in this review, but I'll try to be spoiler-free for the first half of this video. But needless to say, you have been warned. And hey, if you haven't seen this movie yet, you can just watch the series first on Netflix, then watch the movie. You can thank me later. Anyway, on with the movie. So, I'll give a non-spoiler type review here. And it's interesting to note that some people might not even need to see this movie necessarily, because the main series it's based off already provides a satisfying arc for the main character, with its own opening, middle, and conclusion. A message about curiosity followed by redemption followed by acceptance. And this series works best when it raises the personal stakes like that. I found Eternity and the Autumn Memories Doll to be somewhat forgettable, unfortunately, though by no means a bad movie. This movie, on the other hand, properly raises the personal stakes, and it delivered what it promised to its audiences. Because the series was already beautiful for television standards. So beautiful, I would even just call it a 7-hour movie. When I see the quality of animation in this movie, it is just beyond jaw-dropping. They have successfully taken the beauties of real life and implemented them into this movie. After all, creations don't make themselves. And you can tell just by every frame of this movie, with this intricate style, astonishing color palettes, more dynamic movement with the characters and camera movement, that every member of Kyoto Animation really put their heart and soul to every drop of film material that they were given. And in a meta-narrative sense, this works as a swan song for these animators too, because most of them tragically die in a tragic event that happened to their animation studios. Please think of Kyoto Animation in your prayers, everybody. And this movie, as brilliant as it is, does have its fair share of flaws. Not every storyline blends well together. For example, the future timeline, as brilliant as that was portrayed, could have been more relevant to the story in some way. And maybe there could have been a bit more time spent with Violet's foster carer, Tiffany Evergarden, or more time developing Dietfried as a character, with his relations with his brother and his father who he didn't get along well with. But every part of this presentation comes together for an experience I'm never going to forget. And the genius composer Evan Call really has outdone himself here.
The orchestra is richer than ever and really hits every intentional feeling. Whether it be reprising songs from the series, or composing new melodies to fit with the events of this story. And whilst it's fresh in my memory, I've yet to see the sub version of this movie. Yet I believe all the actors and actresses from both the sub version and the dub version have given this their A game here. If you watch the Japanese version, that's the same voice actress as Mikasa who's voicing Violet Evergarden. And she's giving an Oscar-worthy performance here. And the English voice actors and actresses really complement their Japanese counterparts. I love how there's some more raw emotion from Claudia Hodgins in particular. I can safely say this anime movie does justify the dramatized emotions that anime is often known for, because in this story it feels organic. I can feel the solemn maturity of Violet as she reflects on how far she's come. I can feel the utter frustration of Claudia Hodgins in various scenes, to the point where his bursts of anger truly do feel quite authentic. I could practically sense his hoarse throat at one scene, and I love how slow this movie can get. That can turn a lot of people off, especially nowadays, but the slow moments really do allow the audience to really soak in the memories and emotions that the characters are experiencing. Not much else to say, but this movie brilliantly wraps up what's been established in the series.
We start off seeing the granddaughter of the characters from episode 10. Sorry, just compose myself. We start off with the granddaughter of the character that Violet visited in episode 10. Okay. We start off with the granddaughter of the main character. Sorry, I need to compose myself. So, the granddaughter of the little girl that Violet Evergarden helped write letters for her mother in episode 10 from the show. Oh my days. You know that this is going to be a heart-wrenching movie when the first 10 minutes of the movie already makes a lot of people cry. You know you're raising the stakes for the fans when you begin right off the bat mentioning the events of the most heartbreaking as well as the best standout episode from the series. Buckle your seatbelt, Dorothy. We're in for an emotional roller coaster, lads. Although, right off the bat, looking back now, one of my main critiques from this movie is the fact that this future timeline could have been explored a lot more. They do work as effective checkpoints for the start, middle, and ending of this movie, but I was expecting a lot more of it, and I reckon it would probably have been quite fun to see this granddaughter character catch on to the events of this current movie. Though speaking of the past, we cut to Violet's current present, set several years or so after the events of the show and the movie. Violet Evergarden went from an emotionally illiterate former child soldier, and her hard work to understand what love meant has helped her reach a peak in society to the point where she's able to write ceremonial poetry, a hymn of the sea to be more precise, for the local opera singer to read out in public. Most of you will probably remember the opera singer from the special episode of Violet Evergarden. Violet is well respected enough to get a visitation from the mayor and his wife. Yet in this scene alone, we see a lot of growth within Violet herself. In this scene, she doesn't exalt herself in any way. She's humble and honest enough to admit her own sins from the past. And whilst people like Claudia Hodgins might not be fond of that blunt honesty, it is nevertheless an essential growth of character on her part. And that's not only shown narratively, but also visually. Take a look at Violet in this shot and compare it to what she looked like when the show first began. Do you notice the differences? When she first began, she was, of course, younger, but also her eyes were much wider, yet she still seemed emotionally numb back then. She was oblivious to her own wrongdoings at that time. And look at her now, because there are a few subtle new details that I love, because I find it just brilliant how even the character design can subtly tell a story in and of itself. Because here, Violet's face is broadened a bit to indicate she's visibly aged, but look at her eyes here. She has this mature and saddened look in her eyes. They're the kind of eyes that you could look deep into their soul and realize, yeah, that's someone who's seen a lot. That's someone who's matured. Those are the eyes of someone who is aware of their wrongdoings from the past and experienced humility and humbleness firsthand. She began as naive, but then became wiser. And as an artist, I endorse this movie, as well as this franchise, for being able to tell stories through subtle details like that. But it's not just Violet's face that's going through some changes, but society is making some changes as well as technology is beginning to enter the picture. A radio tower made to look like the Eiffel Tower is being constructed. Electricity now powers the lampposts in the street, and the candle guy organizing the lampposts is out of a job. That's so heartbreaking. And with phones being introduced to society, that of course means that the letter writing company of the Autumn Memories Dolls organization that Violet Evergarden works for is likely to come to an end someday. This is quite bittersweet in some ways. It was because of this letter-writing company that Violet was able to empathize with others in the first place. Back in the war, Violet loyally followed Major Gilbert, and as they were both heavily injured at the climax of the war, his last words to her were, "I love you." If it wasn't for the Autumn Memories Doll letter company, Violet could never have learned what "I love you" meant. It could never have learned to empathize with people. So the fact that this company has the potential threat of closing down really adds the sense of finality in this story. Now, keep in mind, that's not to say that people will stop writing letters altogether. It's just that it just won't be as necessary as it once was. Recently, I was talking to a fellow friend from a drama group we attended. I introduced him to the Violet Evergarden series, and he pointed out that if people weren't such wusses, the letter company wouldn't have been as effective as it was. I found that quite funny in the way he said it. Though in many ways, he's right. And I also added, the letter company wouldn't have been nearly as effective if it wasn't for the fact that Leiden experienced a war. Because after such a horrific war, people needed to get in touch with each other and bring back family members together. Which is appropriate because this whole story has been about moving on from pain to find hope, even if it's difficult. Violet herself has managed to move on from her sins of the past, yet she still can't let go of that Major. Gilbert has indeed had such a profound impact on Violet as a person. She can't find the will in her to forget about him. She even visits his mother's tombstone on her daily routine. I need to remind you people that Gilbert was the first person in Violet's life to show any trace of affection towards her. And that love not only affected her, but also the people that she would later meet. Even Dietrich, Gilbert's harsher older brother, is beginning to open up to Violet, even to the point of allowing her to see some of Gilbert's personal treasures. Realistically speaking, he's still a bit of a jerk, but also realistically, he's grown to respect Violet and her associates. Speaking of her associates, all is not doom and gloom at the Autumn Memories Dolls Company, as the other members are moving on to other pastime activities, whether it be collaborating to write plays with the playwright that Violet met, or eating dinner at a restaurant, or even playing tennis. Violet's pastime being a bit of a workaholic, especially when her latest client is somewhat official. A young boy named Eurus, who is suffering from a terminal illness and wants to reconnect with his family whom he had conflicting relations with. And he also wants to send out a message to his best friend. Yeah, you can already tell that Eurus is going to meet his maker much quicker than the other characters in this movie. Here we see some interesting characterization with Violet, in that despite still being quite blunt, she can now predict and analyze people's emotions to a T. Man, Violet's going through so many changes in her life, just like all of us go through some kind of transitional period in our life. I'll focus on my room later. Speaking of drastic changes, Violet and other characters find out a major revelation! Yes, as it turns out, and the marketing for this movie didn't really make this a big surprise, Major Gilbert, who played a crucial role in Violet Evergarden's life, as it turns out, is still alive.
He's alive. He's alive.
Claudia happened to find a letter with Gilbert's handwriting with a stamp posted for a specific island. Claudia finds a letter with familiar handwriting from Gilbert himself, with a stamp from an island in which he's located in. With that vital discovery, Claudia and Violet make a 3-day journey down to the island itself.
It is time
to finally reunite with Gilbert. What I find interesting about how this film is structured is that it doesn't leave much of a surprise that Gilbert's alive. There's 1 or 2 scenes before that clearly show Major Gilbert living amongst the people from that island. And in later scenes, it's revealed that Gilbert is staying with the very people that he used to fight as enemies. Despite losing his right eye and arm, he works as a teacher and someone who helps harvest their grape farms. And all the people of the island say that all the young adult males that went to the war never returned. Only the women, children, and elders remained. Seeing how Gilbert's helping them out of obligation and obviously redemption. Looking back now, I like how this already hints at the fact that Gilbert's doing this out of guilt. It also brilliantly adds to the world building to see that the people who people perceived as enemies are actually people as well. This further emphasizes the whole point in the show that Violet Evergarden had been killing not just enemies, but people. People who had families of their own to love. Now, unfortunately, the 4th trailer that went out to advertise this movie did give away a lot of what happens from this point onwards. What I find really impressive about this movie is that you can know exactly what's going on, beat for beat, predict the whole plot, and it will still move you to tears. It's interesting how the film that doesn't have that many surprises still moves you. It's one of those cases in storytelling where it's not necessarily about the destination, but the journey to get there. And looking at Violet Evergarden as a whole, that's very appropriate because the whole story has been about one emotional journey from emotional numbness to emotional fulfillment. And to make things more dynamic, Gilbert was helping out Violet come to terms with what emotions are at the beginning of the franchise. And now, the roles have reversed. Gilbert is deeply afraid of seeing Violet Evergarden after the war because he feels so guilty about how he used her as a tool and how he eventually caused Violet to lose both her arms. Even though Gilbert did his best to find spare time to teach Violet to read and write and enjoy the simple, beautiful things in life. Gilbert would much have preferred for Violet to be educated rather than going about murdering people. And I find it interesting when a discussion is brought up as to whether or not the relationship between Gilbert and Violet was abusive from the start, indicating that Violet only fell for the Major out of some form of Stockholm Syndrome.
Shut up, Beauty and the Beast. I know.
I actually think Gilbert and Violet's relationship's quite an effective one. Mainly because, A, Gilbert was the first person to show Violet any affection, and up until that point, Violet presumably was brought up in a life of torment and so much evil. In fact, if you look into the lore, it's indicated that Violet was raised in some kind of violent cult. B, Gilbert was the only person who saw traces of humanity in Violet, although Claudia Hodgins eventually saw it too. C, if you look into the lore, right from the get-go, you'll see that, C, if you look into the lore, C, Gilbert genuinely cared about Violet's well-being, and they even make it clear in the movie, before they find out Gilbert's still alive, that Gilbert preferred to teach Violet things rather than command her to do things. D, in this movie, if you think long and hard about it, if Gilbert hadn't left Violet Evergarden, actually change that. D, if you're paying attention, Gilbert wanted Violet Evergarden to live a life outside of the war. That's why he asked Claudia Hodgins to take care of her and take her to the Evergarden mansion to begin with. Gilbert knew that if he had remained in Violet's life after the war, then chances are she would never learn to empathize with others because she'd be so fixated on the Major. Although one can hardly blame Violet for being so fixated on the Major because he was the first person to show affection to her. So in a poetic, bittersweet sense, if Gilbert had never left Violet, she would never have learned to empathize with as many people as she did, and never go through her redemption arc as effectively as she did in the show. Gilbert wanted to teach Violet how to love, and he knew instinctively that love is not just the chemicals firing in your brain to reproduce. It's also the intangible will to seek the best well-being in other people. And finally, as shown in this movie, when Violet finally gets the chance to reunite with Gilbert, he doesn't want to see her. If this relationship were abusive, he would have gone for that relationship right away. But isn't it interesting that Gilbert rejects seeing Violet altogether out of guilt? There's a part of him that's still afraid that if he got back into Violet's life, she would revert back to being an emotionless husk. This is never mentioned in the movie, but I think Gilbert deliberately stayed away from Violet so that she could learn how to grow as a person. But whatever the case, it still shows that Gilbert deeply cared about Violet. But now that he's overwhelmed by guilt, now it's Violet's turn to practice all that she'd learned to revive Gilbert. This is such amazing character development, if you ask me. And I love how some of the other side characters play as crucial roles as much as Violet and Gilbert. Dietfried and Claudia Hodgins both play prominent roles in playing into the lives of Violet and Gilbert. The rest of the Auto Memory Stall team play a crucial role in helping Eurus at one point, and it's a really emotionally engaging scene. Since, if you think about it, Eurus might not play a crucial role in reuniting Violet and Gilbert at first, but he does help Violet be introduced to concepts like promises, and he in turn is very well pleased when he hears that even though Violet didn't show up in person like she'd arranged, Eurus is at least happy that Violet went to see the person who taught her how to love in the first place. That, as well as using a phone to help him with his last efforts before moving on to the heavens, it's a brilliant way of showing that although technology might get rid of the old ways, the technology does come in handy in times like this. That change can be good. And that the other staff members of the Auto Memory Stall organization, they're not just backdrop characters. They're people too, and they'll support Violet all the way, even helping her complete tasks that she couldn't complete at the time. Honestly, the entire last third of this film was just a fireworks display of emotions. You have a scene, those who've seen the film will know what I'm talking about, where I was just laughing with joy, and as soon as it was over, I was properly wailing and howling with tears and crying, like baby whales. As in W-A-I-L-S. The baby whales would have been interesting. Like, it was proper... that kind of crying. Honestly, I don't think I've cried this hard in a while since I rewatched the 10th episode of the series again on Blu-ray. Sorry. Ever since I rewatched on Blu-ray the 10th episode. Honestly, the entire finale was just beautiful. Even though I would have preferred to see a lot more of this world explored, the way that the finale was dealt, it just made me so thankful to God to be alive. Just the whole finale has just made me so thankful to God to be alive to see it. It truly is a feel-good movie. It makes you so happy to be alive. I just felt the same way that I saw this finale, the same way I did with films like When Marnie Was There. A bittersweet yet fulfilling sense of wholesomeness. The film even ends with Violet referencing episode 10. And there's a very sweet scene after the credits. And some 2 great songs. You know, a while back, I made a list of the top things that made me cry in the media. The Violet Evergarden movie could honestly top Grave of the Fireflies. Or maybe on par. Actually, you know what? I think I should put the whole franchise of Violet Evergarden, the series and this movie, on top of my top cry moments. It usually takes a lot to make me cry, but this franchise was one of the few television shows with a movie that went along with it that brought me to absolute tears. Is this movie perfect? Well, there's a lot more source material that I think this film could have benefited from exploring, even just briefly, or even just a mention. Like, what about the actual Evergarden estate? Did Violet ever get in contact with the people who adopted her in the first place? They even adopted Taylor Bartlett at the end of the first movie. I wanted to see more. You know what? That can also be seen as kind of a compliment, because it tells just how invested I was in the series. Certainly I may have seen 1 or 2 critiques saying that the movie might have benefited from being structured as a second season. Although seeing the way this is structured specifically as a finale and seeing just how absolutely gorgeous the presentation is, I'd say this is a very fitting swan song for Violet Evergarden. Although, there were a few side stories that were released alongside with this movie. And apparently, there was even an epilogue light novel in which Major Gilbert goes back to duty for a while before retiring with Violet for a happily ever after. There may be some future content, but if the series as a whole ends here, I wouldn't mind. This is KyoAni's masterpiece, if you ask me. Yeah, it might have some of its problems. People can question Violet's age, or the lack of loose ends from the source material that the show didn't quite fulfill. But as an experience, this is something I am never going to forget. With every frame being so beautiful, it could be hung up as paintings on the wall with... Yeah, I think I need new decorations of some kind here. I'm looking forward to getting this movie on Blu-ray. So, I give Violet Evergarden, the movie, a 12 out of 12. Just, mwah! Beautiful. Perfect. Well, near perfect. Even if there are some inconsistencies in this movie, just the experience is all the more worth it, especially if you've seen the series prior to this. Thank you all so much for watching. What did you think of the Violet Evergarden movie? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video, you can even see my own reaction to the full English dubbed movie that was released on Netflix a few days ago. You can also see other Violet Evergarden related content on my channel here. Scott Meyer, signing out. And possibly gonna cry a river now. It's over. It's already going now.